delightful offer, Senator Sterle, but I think Senator Back might be about ready to breathe normally.
Madam Acting Deputy President, I thank you for the opportunity to rise to speak on the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement in my capacity as Chair of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Legislation Committee. And can I first acknowledge the cooperation of the opposition through Senator Wong, who negotiated with the government the conditions upon which the opposition is now to support the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement legislation. And those areas of agreement, Madam Acting Deputy President, are these. Firstly, in relation to labour, with a U, that Australians should always have priority in the labour market and that overseas workers should only be recruited in circumstances that suitably qualified local workers are not available. And I endorse that as a Western Australian. Of course, we've seen that in projects like Roy Hill, the iron ore project development in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. We have seen that. And the amendment that has been agreed will be that existing requirement under policy that employers seek to sponsor skilled workers on the 457 visas under work agreements will have to demonstrate that they have made recent and genuine efforts to recruit local Australian workers first, and I endorse that. The second relates to amendments to guidelines which are now agreed for companies seeking a work agreement. And these amendments, Madam Acting Deputy President, will incorporate additional criteria for the Minister to consider in approving work agreements. And to ensure observance of those guidelines, they'll be referenced in a new regulation, and I support that. The third relates to activities of the Department of Immigration Border Protection, will include in its annual report details about the number of agreements signed, work agreements signed, including the number of 457 visa holders engaged under the agreements, so that we have program transparency for the Australian community. Fourthly, with regard to subclass 457 visas for overseas tradespersons, the government will amend a visa condition to make it clear that visa holders must also obtain licences, registrations or memberships as required under Commonwealth, state or territory law, and further the visa holder will be obliged to notify the Immigration Department if their licence or their registration is refused, is revoked, ceased or cancelled. And that should give a high degree of satisfaction to those who express so much concern in the negotiations leading up to this agreement. And finally, in this space, Madam Acting Deputy President, the Department of Immigration Border Protection will continue to investigate the evidence-based allegations of non-compliance with visa conditions. Can I make this point in general terms, Madam Acting Deputy President? We are a trading nation. We are the geographic landmass of the United States of America, continentally, with the exception of Alaska, and we have the population of Greater New York, 23 million people. We are not capable of locally and domestically consuming the products that we produce. In our home state, with my colleague Senator Cormann present, his own family very heavily involved in grain production, we export 95% of the 16 million tonnes that we produce in our wheat crop every year. What hope does Australia have to consume 95%? None. Again, if you take our home state of Western Australia, with iron ore production of about 300 million tonnes plus a year, almost 1 million tonnes a day, we do not have the capacity in our country to be able to locally use that iron ore to turn it into steel for various construction and other purposes. And the same would apply with other commodities such as coal from Queensland and New South Wales and others. So therefore we are a trading nation, and we must trade with those countries who desire our products and with whom we can work in terms of our trade agreements. Madam Acting Deputy President, I want to make this point strongly, that the trade with China is worth in excess of $100 billion a year, $2 billion a week. And this is interesting that our exports, Australia's exports to China, are more than the combined value of our exports to the United States of America, Germany, the United Kingdom, South Korea, France, Canada and all of Southeast Asia. That is the scale of Australia's trade with China. And how tremendous it is that we are able to negotiate this trade agreement with this country. And I will comment a little further in a few moments and refer to the statements of some of our trading partners in just how important this agreement is. It is our largest two-way trading partner in goods and services. When you add goods and services, imports and exports, that $100 billion goes up to $160 billion a year last financial year. Our largest destination and our largest source of merchandise imports, valued in excess of $50 billion, but we face increasing competition, Madam Acting Deputy President, from countries like the United States, Canada, the European Union, who are looking eastward into our very sector of the world. For how many years has Australia been that little country down in the bottom right-hand corner of the world, down under? And here we are today. We are front and centre in Asia. Again, our own state. The time zone of Western Australia is within 1 hour east and west of something like 60% of the world's economic activity now. And this is the agreement that is going to open up that opportunity even more for us. It's imperative, of course, that we are able to proceed as we are. I want to go to the comment, if I may, of Jennifer Westacott from the Business Council of Australia, when she made the point that so many of us are aware of. Had we not been able to reach this agreement that we are going to reach today, I hope, the failure to be able to ratify this agreement before the end of December, the failure to have not got the 2 levels of tariff reductions, one for 2015, one for 2016, within days in early January, agriculture alone would stand to have lost more than $330 million. Agriculture alone. But further than that, as Ms Westacott made the observation, that had we not ratified the agreement, or if we don't ratify the agreement, the cost in the financial services sector by 2030, in her estimate, is $4 billion Australian dollars and 10,000 jobs. At a time when the world is in a sense of economic stalemate, the opportunities for this country. And it's just fantastic that the opposition have seen the value and the opportunity. Madam Acting Deputy President, I want to refer to comments by the chairman of Mitsui Australia, Yasushi Takahashi. As we know, Mitsui, an enormous local company with Japanese equity, $8 billion of annual sales here in Australia, iron ore, coal, LNG, agriculture. This is the point that this leading Japanese businessman has made about the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. That Australia has been offered, in his opinion, a unique competitive opportunity through the agreement that we must not miss. And I quote, if I may, Madam Acting Deputy President, from Takahashi, "It is an important fact that China has not made agreements with any other countries that compete with Australia in beef or iron ore or raw materials and other things like that," he said in a speech on the 18th of September. And I will conclude his quotation: "Australia has been given a great opportunity to have a competitive advantage over other exporters to China, so I sincerely hope the Australian Government and the Australian Parliament will not miss this opportunity." Isn't it interesting that that's the statement of a leading Japanese businessman about the opportunity that Australia has with a country with whom they see enormous competition, and that is China. Madam Acting Deputy President, can I address a couple of questions, one of them being the Investor-State Dispute Settlement Scheme. And there seems to be great argument and concern about its impact here in Australia. I want to relate to you my experience doing business in the oil and gas industry in India, with whom, of course, we don't have a free trade agreement, and no opportunity of investor-state dispute settlement. And, of course, a circumstance in which you negotiate in good faith with your client, you sign contracts, you commence your work, and the government of the day says, we're going to put a 2 or 3%, they use the term CESS, C-E-S-S, being a tax or a tariff on all business associated with overseas companies, in their case on this occasion for the purpose of educational advancement. Not into the future, Madam Acting Deputy President, but on all existing contracts. The point I want to make about ISDS is that it helps enormously companies that will be doing business in China or respectively in Japan or Korea, where without this there is limited scope for an Australian company to put itself up against the might, for example, of the Chinese state in a dispute situation. So I say to people who are so concerned about the provision of ISDS in these agreements that it is equally there for the protection of Australian businesses. And what opportunities have we got into the future? It is the fact that when we started negotiating this China-Australia Free Trade Agreement 10 years ago, that commodities were the area in which the Chinese and Australia saw the opportunities. 10 years later, in 2015, it is as much about services as it is about commodities. Why is that the case? China today sees itself in competition with the United States of America to become the greatest economy in the world, but they recognise they have got deficiencies in their services sector. Prudential regulation, corporate governance, insurance, banking, ACCC type activities. And they have recognised, fortunately for us, that Australia actually has these skills in services, in aged care and in health and in architecture and in a range of areas that the Chinese need. They don't want to go to the United States to get that expertise because the United States is their competitor. We are not a competitor of China. Madam Acting Deputy President, the scope, as mentioned by Ms Westacott, for provision of services to China is enormous. And for those of us with children and eventually grandchildren who will be looking for future employment in the high-paid, skilled areas, let us look no further. Let us look no further than the capacity to be able to provide these services in China. One example alone. Today, there are more than 1,100 architects who are engaged on projects in China. Not all of them in China, many of them here in Australia. 1,100 architects today, and we haven't signed or ratified the free trade agreement yet. The Chinese recognise that we have skills that are useful to them, high value, high paying. We've often heard the criticism that how come is it that Chinese can come here and take equity in our assets, and yet we can't do the same in China. The free trade agreement changes that. The example given, Ramsay, for example, in the aged care sector, under the terms of the new agreement, could go and establish a chain of aged care facilities in China, own the land, operate the facilities, put Australian staff in there along with Chinese staff, and expatriate the profits back to Australia if and as they so desire. The same in the health sector, the same in the education sector. We already know that the largest number of overseas students in this country are Chinese. We know that 10% of the Australian population has a Chinese language as their first language in their homes. We know the influence now, and we are so uniquely positioned. Let me also make an observation, if I can, surrounding the whole question of sovereignty. Madam Acting Deputy President, this Parliament at all times has, under our Constitution, and will be able to protect the sovereignty of this nation and the people in it. The question has been asked, do we limit our sovereignty? Does it dilute our sovereignty as a result of signing an agreement such as this one? And I say the answer is no, it does not. This Parliament at any time can rescind any agreement with any country if the Parliament believes that our sovereignty is at risk or is being or has been diluted. I also make an observation, if I may, about commentary regarding currency. The fact that China has a regulated currency and ours is a free floating currency. The simple point is that this free trade agreement and any other free trade agreement that we are or have negotiated do not have currency provisions. Many countries peg their currencies, for example, wisely or unwisely in the case of some South American countries, to the US dollar. It's a question for those countries, but nothing at all impacts our competitiveness as a result of the signing of this free trade agreement. Madam Acting Deputy President, let me conclude, if I may, with the value of this and other agreements to this country. We now have signed a free trade agreement with Korea and with Japan, and we will hopefully ratify this one. But there's another point that the community needs to be aware of, and that is that the Minister and his negotiating team have negotiated most favoured nation status between Australia and those countries. What does it mean? What it simply means is if the Koreans at some time in the future participate in a free trade agreement with another country, let's say associated with a commodity that we also export into that country, we must enjoy at least those conditions, the best, most favoured nation conditions. And I think it's important that we realise that each of these free trade agreements, whilst, if you like, ratified and signed by the Parliament, they are only the beginning of a new relationship, Madam Acting Deputy President. If I can give you an example of our relationship with Japan, in which rice was not included anywhere near to the extent. We know there are very high tariffs on the import of rice into Japan. Why do I make that observation? Because the average age of Japanese farmers is now 68 years of age. The size of their land titles are too small for economic production of rice. The title system for purchase and sale of agricultural land in Japan is so tight that it is simply impossible or very difficult now to actually produce an agricultural land of a critical mass sufficient to be able to economically produce rice, and also to, of course, the younger members of the Japanese community are now mainly in cities and not following their families into farming. Why is this important, Mr Acting Deputy President? Because if and as Japan gets to the stage where they will no longer be self-sufficient in rice production, and they're getting very close to that now, they will look to Australia under the Japanese-Australia Free Trade Agreement and the most favoured nation status, and they must inevitably have a look to us as being those who can produce and export rice in a price and of a quality that they want. So the point I do want to leave the chamber with is that each of these agreements builds on the other. Each of these agreements is the starting point, Mr Acting Deputy President, for an absolute new wave of economic activity, in the case of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, in services, in commodities, in future wealth, in growing the size of the cake. Mr Acting Deputy President, if we are going to see continued economic advancement, continued employment, continued investment into and from this country, it is going to be because we continue to understand and remember that we are a trading nation, that we are a nation on a huge landmass, blessed with plenty of commodities, blessed with a well-educated population of people, but a very small population of people. And we always know that the best way of avoiding soldiers coming over borders, acting Deputy President, is to make sure trade and investment cross those borders.
Thank you, Senator.